Okay, guys, so to start the cell cycle notes, I wanted to start by going over some of the differences and similarities of both animal and plant cells. So if you have not already filled this out and gotten it approved by me, then go do that now. But hopefully we got that done, and we will continue, or actually start down here. So how this connects to everything that we've been talking about so far last unit is that it can be tied back to some of the characteristics of life. So if you remember, the characteristics of life are one of the reasons like the cell cycle is driven, or why we need the cell cycle, why it's important, why we're even going over it. So one of the main characteristics of life, the one that pretty much everyone could remember, was that it's composed of cells. Okay, so when development starts, you are just one cell. When conception happens and the egg and the sperm are joined together, they form one cell. But then, looking at your body now, you are made up of trillions and trillions of cells. So those cells had to divide or multiply, replicate somehow. And that's what we're going to talk about with the cell cycle. So the second way it relates back to the characteristics of life is that the cell cycle helps maintain homeostasis. So remember, homeostasis was just the constant internal environment that a body tries to keep, or organisms try to keep, especially even cells. And so when cells are damaged or old, they need to be replaced. So they do have a life cycle. Cells have a life cycle. When they get to the end of that life cycle, or if they're damaged somehow, then they need to be replaced by other cells, and that's why we need to keep doing the cell cycle. That's why it's continuously happening. And then the third characteristic of life is growth and development. So growth and development, like I kind of mentioned up with composed of cells, in order for an organism to grow, it requires the amount of living material to increase. And what are the living things that organisms are made up of? Cells. So basically, that's a fancy way of saying our cells have to increase in order for us to grow and develop. And then another reason we care about the cell cycle is that it allows for multicellularity. And that's a big word, but if we break it down, it basically means more than one cell. So multicellularity is just consisting of more than one cell. And a one-celled organism is called unicellular. So as humans, we are multicellular. And multicellularity allows for differentiation. And another really complex word, differentiation, just means being different. So it's where cells change type to perform a specific function. So your body isn't just made of one cell. A lot of your groups of cells have different functions, like your neurons or your brain cells perform a completely different function than your skin cells or your stomach cells. They each have their own duties or functions to perform. Next, let's look at the genetic material for organisms. So most of the genetic material for eukaryotic organisms is deoxyribonucleic acid, or as we like to call it, DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid is where we get that acronym, DNA. And some of the properties of DNA, it's double-stranded, it's helical, and as the name implies, which molecule of life is it? It is a nucleic acid. And the reason DNA is so important, or the reason we're so concerned with it, is that it codes for genetic information. And that's something really important that we will go into way more in depth later on. But for now, just know that DNA goes into producing your genetics and producing your traits. And the genetic material, or our DNA, is stored in the nucleus of every cell in your body. And I put that in all caps because it is such a crazy important fact. So it's located in every cell in your body. So like I said earlier, there are trillions and trillions and trillions of cells. In each cell, each individual cell has all of the genetic information for your body. So if stretched out, the entire genetic information that fits in one cell would be about 6 feet long. So there are 6 feet of genetic information in every single cell in your body. Just think about that for a second. 6 feet of DNA in every single cell in your body. So you're probably like, well, how in the world does that happen? How does that fit? How do those 6 feet, there's no way that 6 feet of DNA could possibly fit into a teeny tiny little cell? Well, yes, it can, but it has to go through different phases or different formations first. So what we typically think of when we see DNA or we talk about our genetic material is chromosomes. And chromosomes are just the tightly coiled strands of chromatin. So lots of C words that we'll be going over. But chromosomes, that you're probably most familiar with DNA as, chromosomes are just tightly coiled strands of chromatin. And chromatin, hopefully from our cell trading cards, we remember that chromatin is just DNA wrapped around proteins. So another function for proteins called histones. And chromatin appears as granular material, or it's just really fuzzy. We kind of can't make it out in the nucleus when chromosomes are not visible. So chromosomes are not always visible, and we'll talk about that in our like the next page, I think. Chromosomes aren't always just nice and neat and pretty in the cell. It mainly exists as chromatin, where it's just like granular. You can't really make anything out. It just looks really grainy in the nucleus. And like I said, chromosomes are only present at certain stages of the cell cycle that we'll talk about in a minute. The nice, neat, pretty chromosomes that are easy to count are only present at certain stages of the cycle. So let's go down here to our blank spot that you have. And I want you to illustrate this picture as best you can, because I think it does a really good job of showing how it goes from the DNA double helix that you see, and then that gets wrapped around these histone proteins, like this, just wrapped around it. And then those proteins like to join up to make chromatin. And then a bunch of those chromatins coil and make the chromosome. So, as best you can, draw this. And if you can't draw very well, just label. So you have your double helix down here. That DNA gets wrapped around histones, just a protein. And then those histones they have an attraction to one another, so they like to clump up together and make chromatin, which is just basically long strands. And then those strands get coiled to form chromosomes. So this is very important that we understand how that 6 feet of genetic material fits inside every single cell, because DNA is very, very thin, very small, very, very thin, string-like. And so then it gets wrapped around these pretty small histone proteins, and then they bind together and clump together so that then they form chromatin, and that's what we see in the nucleus most of the time. And then that chromatin at a certain stage in the cell cycle will coil to become chromosomes. And if we weren't confused enough by all the C words, I'm going to add one more that's really important to understanding the cell cycle. So the chromosomes that we see, the nice, neat little chromosomes like this, that looks like an X, is actually made of 2 chromosomes. This is a chromosome pair. So it's actually made of 2 chromosomes, but when they're joined like this, at the middle right there, one side of this is called a chromatid. So I want you writing this on there, a chromatid. So a chromosome is made of 2 chromatids. Okay, that'll be really important to know when we start looking at the cell cycle even closer. Okay, so pause the video if you need to get all of this drawn as best you can and definitely labeled. Okay? So now that you got everything down here labeled and drawn, because remember, we know to draw our things now in case you thought we didn't have to. We definitely do. It's super helpful. I don't just draw it to show off my artistic abilities or force you to draw it. I just want you to draw it because it is helpful. Okay, so back up here, the number of chromosomes. So that's something to talk about. The number of chromosomes is basically just how much genetic material it has. And the chromosomes are a defining characteristic of a species. So not every species, definitely not every animal, every mammal, every plant, they definitely do not have the same number of chromosomes. It just depends. And here's a really important thing. It is not related to the complexity of the organism. I'm even going to underline not, circle it. It is not related to the complexity of the organism. So you hear like, oh, humans have 46 chromosomes, so they're really complex, and since we're the most complex mammal, we must have the most complex DNA, most DNA. Not true. Because it's not related to the complexity of an organism. As far as organisms go, we are pretty complex. But if we look over here at this chart I have made for you, over here, I just put down some of the organisms you might be familiar with and the number of chromosomes that they have. So the fruit fly, little teeny tiny little fruit fly. They have 8 chromosomes. So they fit 8 chromosomes in every cell in their teeny tiny little body. And then a kangaroo, which is not a mammal, it's a marsupial, but still, you think kangaroos, they're a pretty complex organism. So those kangaroos only have 16 chromosomes. Okay? But you're like, oh, well that's still more than the fruit fly. Well, if we look at everyone's favorite, garlic also has 16 chromosomes. Okay? So kangaroos are obviously more complex than garlic, but they have the same number of chromosomes. So the number of chromosomes isn't related to the complexity. Humans will come to find this out and know this number, 46. We have 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. And a tobacco plant, a measly little plant, has more chromosomes than we do. Cotton, which you think might be pretty simple, cotton has 52 chromosomes. And then, quite possibly the most opposite things on this list, a strawberry and an elephant. They both have 56 chromosomes. So all of these things have more chromosomes than humans. Are they all more complex than us? No, not necessarily. Tobacco, garlic, strawberry, they're not more complex than us. Elephants are, pretty complex, I'd say, on the same level as us. But that just goes to show that it's not related to the complexity of the organism. Okay, so moving on here. There are different types of chromosomes. And there are the chromosomes that are found in the somatic or body cells. And they contain a diploid number. And as you'll find out, diploid means 2. So it basically just means like double, or they're like doubled up on. Okay? It means 2, that you multiply it by 2. So each chromosome has a partner or a pair. So when we look at chromosomes like we did down here, they do occur in pairs. So the diploid number for humans is 46, which means we have 23 pairs. So if we looked at the chromosomes for human, you would see 23 of these, but remember that each of these is technically a chromosome. So you have 46 of these, 23 pairs in your body cells. It's different though for our gametes or our sex cells. So your gametes contain the haploid number. Haploid or half. So in the haploid number, each chromosome is single. So instead of seeing them looking like this, instead of that being the chromosome made of 2 chromatids, you just see one set or one side of it, and it kind of just looks like that. And then the other one will be over here, and then there will be another one over here. They don't pair up like this. Okay? So if the human diploid number is 46, the haploid number is 23. Okay, so now let us talk about cell division and mitosis. So cells must divide when they reach a certain size. So at a certain point, the things inside the cell will continue to divide, and then at a certain point, the cell membrane won't be able to hold it anymore, and so it will initiate the division. So we can say the surface area of the cell membrane to the volume of the cytoplasm ratio, meaning that if the volume of the cytoplasm gets too much and is putting too much pressure on the surface area of the cell membrane, then it has to divide. So that we say the cell membrane determines cell division. Another really important thing it does. And through division and mitosis, this allows for the growth and development of organisms. So the first type of cell division let's talk about is in bacteria, because it's a bit more simple, it's not as complicated, so we'll go over that first. So prokaryotic cells, like bacteria are, and if we think back to our last unit's notes, we know that prokaryotic cells lack which part of the cell? They lack a nucleus, so they have less to divide, so it's a little bit more simple. So prokaryotic cells reproduce by binary fission. And we know that bi means two, so binary fission literally just means like one cell splitting into two. And binary fission is a form of asexual reproduction. And we know that A means what? Without. So asexual literally means without sex. So in asexual reproduction, only one parent produces offspring without exchanging genetic material with another organism. So asexual reproduction means without sex, so it happens with one parent having children, in air quotes, or producing offspring without any exchange of genetic material. So, to reiterate, only one organism is required. And through that, it produces two genetically identical daughter cells. Or as you might be familiar with it, clones. So since there's no exchange of genetic material, they basically just copy their genetic material and divide. So the two daughter cells are exactly like the first cell. And this is due to the process of mitosis. Okay, so cell division in eukaryotes is a bit more complicated. So eukaryotic cells are things like plants, animals, protists, fungi. They all follow this. They follow the cell cycle, which are the processes that take place in the life of a cell. So remember that the cell is a living thing, so its entire life is basically defined by it's constantly going through the cell cycle. Because it is a continuous process, even though it's divided into stages. So basically the entire cell's purpose, its life, is just going through this continuous cycle and never, ever, ever stopping that cycle. Because if it stopped the cycle, then we'd be dead. So the cell cycle is divided into 3 parts. First up, we have interphase, and that's the period of growth between cell divisions. So when the cell's not dividing, it's basically an interphase. And then we have mitosis, which is the nuclear division, or the division of the nucleus. And when we divide the nucleus, we divide everything inside of it, which includes the genetic material. And then the third part of the cell cycle is cytokinesis. And cytokinesis is just the division of the cytoplasm. So that is actually when the cell divides and becomes 2. These other 2 parts of the cell cycle, it's still just the one cell. And then here, it becomes 2. So we'll go a bit more in depth into the 3 stages in the cell cycle. So the first one is interphase. An interphase is divided into 3 stages itself. The first stage, which is called G1. G is for growth. And this is the largest portion of the cell's life. So it spends majority of its life growing in this interphase, in G1 of interphase. So since cells are living things, they will also have those characteristics of life, and one of the characteristics of life is growth and development. So cells also have to grow. And the second stage of interphase is S, just the S phase. And S stands for synthesis. And synthesis just means to make, making. I'll just put making up here. If you're synthesizing something, that means you're making it. And so in synthesis, it's replicating or copying the DNA. So if we remember that mitosis is when the nucleus divides and everything in the nucleus divides, in order for each cell to have the right number of genetic material, it has to duplicate first, and then it can divide. So an interphase is when it duplicates, when the genetic material is replicated. And then it goes through another period of growth where it prepares for division. So interphase is made up of one growth period, then it replicates the DNA, and then there's another growth period right before it's going to divide. And most of its life is this stage of the cell cycle is during interphase. And then when it's prepared for division, it will go into mitosis, which is the division of the nucleus. So mitosis is divided into 4 substages. The first one is prophase. And prophase is where the chromosomes are going to coil. So up here in interphase, this is where it'll exist as chromatin. It won't be chromosomes yet, because in mitosis is when they coil and condense into chromosomes. So up here it's just chromatin. And then in mitosis is when you start to see those nice, neat little chromosomes. Also in prophase, the nuclear envelope, which is just like the membrane that surrounds the nucleus, that breaks down and spindle fibers form. So Prophase is also kind of just getting the parts ready for mitosis. The next phase of mitosis is metaphase. And in metaphase, chromosomes line up in the middle or the equator of the cell. So I just remember this: metaphase, middle, the chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell. And then we have anaphase. If you remember from your bio terms, ana was one of the words, and ana meant towards. So in anaphase, the chromatids separate. So remember on this part right here, I'm going to try to draw it really small. That's your chromosome. It'll kind of look like an X, and then they're all lined up in the middle. And then those will separate, giving you one little part, half of it, and the other little half of it. In anaphase, the chromatids separate and go to opposite ends or poles. And then after anaphase is telophase. And that's just when the nuclear envelope reforms. So up here, it breaks down so that the contents of the nucleus are just kind of out. And then the chromatids separate, and then it reforms around those new chromatids. So in this cell now, we still just have one cell, but we have two nuclei because they had to replicate. And we still have double the amount of genetic material because that was replicated up here. So that in each nucleus, since we have two nuclei now in the cell, each nucleus has the correct amount of genetic material because it was duplicated up here, and then it was split in half down here to the normal half that the cells are supposed to have. But it still only exists in one cell at this point. And then, very quickly after that, cytokinesis happens. And cytokinesis is the division of the cytoplasm. And this is actually when the cell splits into two. So if I were to ask you, what's the process of a cell splitting into two? You would not tell me mitosis, you would tell me cytokinesis. Okay? And it does happen differently in different types of cells. So cytokinesis in plant cells, it forms a new cell wall or a cell plate. And it forms at the equator to separate the two daughter cells. So basically, I'll draw it over here. You'll have your cell, and it's gone through interphase and mitosis. So you'll have a nucleus over here, you'll have a nucleus over here, and then this new wall will kind of build up in the middle. And then you have two cells. But cytokinesis in animal cells happens a bit differently since we don't have cell walls. The cell membrane folds inward at the equator and pinches off, and this is termed the cleavage furrow. So in an animal cell, it'll kind of look like this with the two nuclei, and then as it keeps closing, it'll pinch off like that. Okay? So remember, the entire function of the cell cycle is to produce two daughter cells. That's what we call the offspring or the cells, they're daughter cells. Two daughter cells with the same number of chromosomes as the parent cell. So the whole goal is that we want it to be identical in mitosis. There are going to be some cases where they don't come out identical to the parent cell, and we'll talk about those in later units. But just keep that in mind. They're supposed to be identical, but that doesn't always happen. So this is a continuation of the last slide. And I do want you to draw this as best you can because it's really important, and it shows the different parts of the cell cycle and kind of how long they last compared to the others. And it also shows what the cell looks like at that time. So it's really important. Try to get this drawn as best you can, and then we'll talk through it. So we know that it's a cycle, so you can really start anywhere, but we're going to try to start at like the most obvious starting point, which is right here. So it just went through cytokinesis and split into two, and then this cell's life immediately begins, so it immediately goes into interphase. And so the first part of interphase was G1, remember? So make sure you get that drawn. You don't have to worry about this over here. We're not going to go into that. But G1 is the first phase. And remember, this is just a period of growth. It's living its life. It's doing its thing. Okay? So after the G1 phase, we still have the same number of genetic material. We each have one chromatid. At this point, it's a chromosome. Okay? And then we go into the S phase. So remember, S stood for synthesis, which just means it's making something. And in here, it's making the genetic material. So it's duplicating the genetic material. So you can see now that it has two chromatids on the chromosome. Down here, it just had one little line. And here it has these two, and they've joined up. So the genetic material has doubled. We're still in interphase, but we're in G2. And in G2, basically the cell like double checks and makes sure that it's ready for mitosis or ready to divide. Start the cell cycle or dividing. So here we still have two chromosomes, four chromatids, which is double what we had over here. And then we go into mitosis. Okay? So I'm going to write the phases of mitosis here in order. Is prophase. You can't see that. Is prophase. That's a P. Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And that lovely abbreviation we call PMAT. Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. So here the nucleus is dividing. I'm going to write that because it's super important. Nucleus is dividing. And then we hit cytokinesis. And that's when the cell finally splits into two. So if you look, because the cell split into two, we end up back with the same number of chromosomes as we started with. Okay? So these cells are constantly going through the cycle to produce new cells for growth and repair. So it's not like the cell just gets to chill. No, once the cell is produced from cytokinesis, it immediately goes into interphase and is living its life, and then it'll divide. So thank goodness they continually divide, because that allows us for growth and repair and to keep us healthy. And if I were to give you this diagram and ask you to interpret it, just looking at it, which is going to be the longest phase of the cell cycle. So if we take all the subparts of interphase, you can tell that that makes up the majority of the cell's lifetime. And interphase can last anywhere from 18 to 24 hours. So it can be an interphase for 18 to 24 hours. Mitosis is only a few hours, and then cytokinesis happens pretty quickly. So the cell spends most of its life during growth, doing DNA replication and double checking, living its life. Okay, so that covers mitosis. But there's also another type of cell division that we'll talk about that happens in eukaryotes, in a different type of cell in eukaryotes. And this process is called meiosis. And meiosis happens in the gametes, or the sex cells. So in most mammals, that's the sperm and the egg. Those are our gametes. So up here in mitosis, that was happening in just our body cells, or what we call these somatic cells, just your normal body cells, like your skin, your stomach cells, your, I don't know what else, every type of cell in your body except the sex cells that you are born with. Okay, so the sex cells are haploid. Remember, haploid means half. They're haploid in chromosome number. And the reason for this is that it ensures the offspring of sexual reproduction will have diploid number. Because when new organisms are formed and you get the normal amount of DNA, which is the diploid number, I'm going to make that look better. And you have the diploid number, so let's just say it's one chromosome. It gets half of that from the mom, and half of it from the dad. Okay, so that's why in sex cells, in order for them to form a viable offspring, they have to have half the number, because when they combine with the other gamete to make a zygote, they have to have half the number, so when they join together, they have the normal number. Okay? So sexual reproduction is the exchange of genetic material between two individuals to form a new organism. So sexual reproduction is the exchange of genetic material, because what has those genetic material? Those are found in the gametes, because every cell has them. Between two individuals. That's really important. So if any organism is going through sexual reproduction, it has to have two organisms present in order to form a new organism. So reproduction is a characteristic of life. Remember, in order to perpetuate the species, not necessarily the individual, but this is how the species continues on. From two individuals, a new being can be formed. So the haploid number for humans is 23, meaning that all of your somatic cells, all of your body cells have 46 chromosomes, but your sex cells, your gametes, your sperm or your egg only has 23. Because if we get 23 from mom and 23 from dad, put them together and you get 46. So the parents' gametes give half of the offspring's genetic makeup. And we will get way more into genetics. Just remember, half of it comes from mom, about half of it comes from dad. And these sex cells are formed by meiosis, which is kind of like mitosis, but a bit different. So instead of just going through PMAT once, it will go through PMAT twice. So the nucleus divides 2 times, so that it results in 4 haploid cells. And we're going to watch a video that goes into meiosis a bit more and gives some good graphics, better than the ones that I can obviously not draw over here. But this formation of sperm results in 4 identical, that's important, identical appearing sperm cells, and this is called spermatogenesis. Big word, it basically just means new sperm. In the formation of eggs, you get 4 cells, but 3 of them are these polar bodies, and they're small and degenerate and aren't really viable. And then you get 1 egg cell called the ovum, and that is what results in fertilization. And that is called oogenesis, which literally means new egg, which you'll find out from your bio terms later on. So remember that there's a hint there. And then, because you have these sex cells, we have our sex chromosomes. So the sex chromosomes basically just determine the sex of the individual. And we'll, like I said, get more into this when we talk about genetics. But basically, well, I'll talk about it in a second when we get down there. But in humans, it's the 23rd pair. So in humans, in typical humans, if there's not like a malfunction or anything, there are both X and Y chromosomes. But in females, there's only an XX. And then in males, there's an XY. And so that Y chromosome there is basically what gives men typical male characteristics. So it produces the testosterone and the testes and things like that. And females just don't have a Y chromosome. So basically that makes them female. If you have a Y chromosome, then you're a male. So this is your sex chromosomes, and the other 22 pairs are called autosomal chromosomes. Or like I was saying, somatic. Autosomal, somatic. Okay, but that is all for meiosis. Like I said, we will be doing lots more practice with this. We will be doing a video over, and you will be completing little manipulatives over meiosis and mitosis. Okay?